We are covering a critical topic for the Texas real estate exam: earnest money disputes and the remedies for default. On the exam, you'll be tested on what happens when a deal falls apart and who gets to keep the earnest money. When a dispute arises, the title company, acting as the escrow agent, cannot simply decide who is right. If the buyer and seller can't agree in writing on how to disperse the earnest money, the title company is stuck in the middle. Their only recourse to avoid a lawsuit is to file an interpleader action with a court. This means they deposit the earnest money with the court, and the court decides who gets it. The exam loves to test your knowledge of this process. A common trap is a question where one party seems clearly in the wrong. But the correct answer is that the title company cannot release the funds without a written agreement or a court order. Remember, the escrow agent is a neutral third party. Before it gets to a lawsuit, the Texas Real Estate Commission, or TREC, contract encourages mediation. Paragraph 16 of the 1-4 family residential contract includes a provision where the parties can agree to mediate before filing a suit. For the exam, know that mediation is a common and often required first step to resolve disputes. It's a confidential process where a neutral third party helps the buyer and seller try to reach a mutually acceptable solution. Now, let's talk about what happens when a party defaults. The exam will expect you to know the difference between the available remedies. The two main remedies are specific performance and monetary damages, which often come in the form of the seller retaining the earnest money. Specific performance is a court order compelling a party to fulfill their contractual obligation. Because real estate is considered unique, a buyer can sue a defaulting seller to force them to sell the property as agreed. While a seller can also sue a buyer for specific performance, it is much rarer because retaining the earnest money is a faster and easier remedy. If the buyer defaults, the seller's most common remedy is to terminate the contract and receive the earnest money as liquidated damages. This releases both parties from the contract. The exam might present a scenario where a buyer fails to secure financing after the financing contingency period has expired. In this case, the buyer is in default and the seller is typically entitled to the earnest money. Conversely, if the seller defaults, for example, by refusing to make agreed-upon repairs or failing to move out by the closing date, the buyer has several options. The buyer can terminate the contract and get their earnest money back. The buyer can also sue for specific performance to force the sale or sue for monetary damages. A key point of confusion on the exam is distinguishing between a true default and a termination under a contract contingency. If a buyer terminates during their option period, or because they couldn't get financing within the time allowed by the financing addendum, they are not in default and are entitled to their earnest money back. A common exam trap is to present a situation where a buyer backs out, but for a legally permissible reason under the contract. Here's a mnemonic to help you remember the seller's primary options when a buyer defaults: sue or keep. The seller can either sue for specific performance or damages, or they can keep the earnest money. This simplifies the seller's main choices in a default situation. For free practice questions, AI-powered explanations, and more exam prep tools, visit openexamprep.com. That's openexamprep, all one word, .com.